I was so pleased to catch up with my old friend Naveen Ramankutty. Naveen is a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he's one of the world's leading thinkers on how the food system has to change in order for us to solve some of our biggest environmental problems. So, Naveen, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us think a little bit more about climate solutions. But first, I'd really love to get your perspective on kind of the problems around climate change and how it's going to be affecting us. And especially because you think a lot about our food systems and how those work and land use and things we do kind of on the land to sustain ourselves. How does climate change affect all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the really challenging part about climate change is that there isn't any one thing that's causing climate change. There are, a multitude of different actions that humans do going through our day-to-day lives that affects climate change. So, driving our cars, heating our houses, and it turns out also eating our food. And so, I always think about the idea that nobody is really causing climate change deliberately. It's just an emergent property of our society as it's currently set up. The solutions to the problem also, in turn, have to deal with we have to deal with a whole bunch of different issues at the same time. I think you yourself have said that there isn't a silver bullet. We have to deal with energy, we have to deal with land use, we have to deal with food systems, we have to deal with heating, and then we have to deal with flights and long distance shipping and transportation and so on. Yeah, so that's the challenge. Where do I see possible solutions? The thing that's given me hope in the last few years is, first, I feel like, while there is so much inertia in our kind of technological system and our infrastructure and so on, the social inertia seems to be moving much faster. Obviously, we've seen kids on the street who are really asking our leaders and our adults to grown-ups to be grown-ups and do something about this problem. I'm inspired by that. I'm also inspired by some of the technological solutions too. The cost of solar and wind seems to be getting cheaper and cheaper much faster than people had anticipated. I see my students. A lot of my students are vegan or vegetarian. Like between generations, we can see these changes happening really rapidly. So that's what gives me some hope.
Yeah, that's all great. Well, let me dig in a little bit more on some of the specifics. I'd love to get your expertise on this. And as you said, the food we eat and the way we grow it and the land we have to clear to make this all possible is actually surprisingly to some people one of the bigger contributors from our global economy to climate change. Some of the data we're showing looks at like electricity is about a quarter of climate change problem, and the larger food systems about a quarter as well, depending how you do the math. But within that, what are some of the kind of key issues? Because that's a big system. It's like from the farmer's field all the way to our fork and all the way to the landfill. There's a lot of stuff in there. If you had to single out a few things within the food system as kind of the most important to focus on, what would they be, or some of the bigger solutions? Because there's just so many things being talked about. It's hard for people to kind of sort it out and figure out which are the most high impact, high leverage opportunities and the ones that might be good and helpful, but maybe are a little bit low leverage by comparison.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is deforestation. You talked about how a quarter of that of our entire climate change problem comes from the food and land use system. I think about a little less than half of that comes from just CO2 emissions from deforestation. And yeah, I mean, we've deforested land for a long time for growing crops. But if you look at why the majority of deforestation is occurring today, it's not really occurring to provide food calories. It's occurring to provide, growing commodities, really. Brazil and Indonesia alone contribute to 70% of the deforestation today. And in Brazil, it's mostly for growing soy, and in Indonesia, it's mostly for growing, palm oil. So if we can deal with those problems, I mean, most of these crops are going into industrial products or as animal feed. So dealing with that is one big section, one big chunk. The other food-related emissions come from methane emissions from livestock production and cultivating rice paddies, as well as nitrous oxide emissions from growing fertilizers. There was a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago, looking at the global nitrogen cycle, and they pointed out, there's been a big increase in nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture that's not been as talked about recently. So again, in terms of solutions, I mean, I think a lot of people talk about growing our livestock more sustainably in terms of reducing methane emissions. But the way I think about it is, if there is a cow, that cow will emit methane, and maybe we can figure out ways to make it make its methane emissions lower by changing the feed or adding feed additives and so on. But that cow is going to emit methane no matter what. So, there's been a lot of attention paid recently to kind of shifting diets. I don't necessarily think we all need to become vegan, but even just reducing the amount we eat can make a big difference. Or eating lower down the food chain, eating more white meat rather than red meat. Coming back to deforestation, that's a huge challenge because it has to come from kind of government policies. I don't think deforestation is a problem that individuals can deal with directly. Most people are just earning their living. So the governments can provide incentives. REDD is a very commonly known international policy for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, to try to provide incentives to set up projects where people are actually paid to either not deforest or to conserve their existing forests. Finally, nitrous oxide emissions, that's a huge challenge. We grow our food today, our kind of current food production relies on nitrogen by a huge amount. About half of all the nitrogen that we fix on this planet is for food production. One obvious solution is to make our use of nitrogen more efficient. Currently, we kind of misuse nitrogen in a lot of places. But again, that's a solution where we need policy. It's not something that consumers can deal with. It's where we need policies to, broadly speaking, across landscapes, where we can incentivize farmers to grow their crops in more nitrogen efficient ways.
Yeah, let's dig in a little bit. This is really interesting stuff. So maybe take each of these in turn, one at a time, if you don't mind. So like deforestation, I mean, that's kind of shocking to a lot of people. I think what you just said is that like 70% of the deforestation on the planet is in two countries. It's Indonesia and Brazil. Brazil had lowered their deforestation rate a lot, but now it's kind of shooting back up again due to big changes in policies there. And as you pointed out, these aren't like people clearing land to grow food for like, starving kind of, underprivileged peasants or something like that. This is for global commodity traders and oil palm going to China and, soybeans being fed to pigs halfway across the world, or more cattle or something. This is kind of convenience foods and commodities for the middle class of the world, not the world's poor. So that's kind of weird. And it's also so tightly concentrated. I mean, like 70% in two countries, and what about like 3 or 4 commodities as a whole? Wow, what an amazing opportunity though for the world to focus. It's not like 100 million little power plants and cars. It's like 2 countries are most of the problem. That seems like a really good opportunity to me. What can we do about that, do you think?
Obviously, the political situation in Brazil right now is not conducive to dealing with that problem very easily. I don't know if I have any good answers. I mean, I had hopes for Brazil before the government changed. I mean, and this is where I think that the power that consumers have is not in necessarily changing their own behavior, but actually voting for the right people. That can be hugely powerful, not just in Brazil, but other places around the world as well.
Yeah, so the deforestation one is kind of a big picture policy change, but the policy change is actually fairly strategic. It's like, we don't need every country in the UN to be worrying about deforestation so much. We need these two to get a lot of the quick progress. So I think that's something that we need to rethink a little bit as we think about international agreements and policies, like a UN style agreement of 208 different sovereign nations or whatever may not be always the way we have to solve problems. Sometimes it's bilateral, trilateral kinds of agreements that can get a lot done.
I mean, maybe I should talk about kind of some of the glimmers of hope, which might be that there are kind of organizations, companies themselves that are volunteering to kind of source their food from non-deforested land. How effective that is probably still up in the air. I mean, obviously Brazil's deforestation has gone back up. But at least that's hope that people are trying to work outside of the national policy setup to find out ways where consumers can have some influence over where their food comes from, and that companies are going along with that. So for oil palm, for example, there were calls for boycotting oil palm. A lot of people I know, my parents-in-law, for example, know that oil palm is an issue. So that's great. There's information that's filtering down to consumers, and hopefully that can filter back to kind of actions on the ground.
Yeah, that was some of the. That's a really good point because one of the early successes when Brazil did reduce its deforestation rate by 70 to 80 or more percent, that was largely attributed to this kind of commitments by big business in Brazil and international businesses to source their crops from places that weren't deforesting land. And that was done because of big international pressure on companies like Bunge and Cargill and others that, they don't want to be attacked by Greenpeace or whoever all the time. So they realized, hey, we can grow more on the land we've already cleared and leave those forests alone. So that worked for a long time, but Bolsonaro and the change of government has kind of undermined a lot of that recently. But maybe there's some lessons still there. But I want to get back to nitrous oxide. This is a greenhouse gas like almost nobody even knows exists, and yet it accounts for probably about 3 times the effects on climate change that all the flying on Earth could possibly do, and yet we hear almost nothing about it. And when we talk about nitrogen pollution, part of it is in the atmosphere, nitrous oxide being a greenhouse gas, but the other part of the pollution is nitrate that goes into water. And that becomes a big pollutant there too for drinking water and ultimately for even like whole ocean ecosystems. So, kind of managing our nitrogen, we hear all about carbon all day long, but nitrogen, the other little friend on the periodic table, is super important as well. And what can we do there? We got to think outside the one. We got to do more than just one letter at a time, I guess is the thing. Again, become a little bit more fluent in the periodic table. But managing nitrogen turns out to be like a climate problem too. And we never, I don't hear about it that way as much as we should. But what do we think we have to do there?
I mean, I think it was Paul Crutzen, right, who first brought our attention to nitrous oxide a long time ago. Yeah. So I remember reading this book by James Gustav Speth called Red Sky in the Morning. I think you probably read that as well. And, he talks about how once we solve the carbon problem, we're going to have a nitrogen problem next, right? And I think it's something people don't think about very much. I'll come back to your question in a second, but I sometimes think about the fact that we focus so much on solving the carbon problem and the climate change problem, and we imagine that once that's solved, that we'll be all better off. And I think we have to think a bit broader than that about the kind of the cumulative impact of human societies as a whole, that we impact the Earth system in multiple ways. One of the kind of thought experiments I sometimes play out in my head is what happens if, there's been this promise of nuclear fission for a long time, and that we'll have infinite source of, cheap energy if only nuclear fission worked out. And I play that thought experiment out, and it's not very pretty in my head, which is that, okay, we'll probably have a lot of energy, but I'm not convinced that we will use it responsibly. I worry that we'll use that infinite source of energy to kind of deforest the rest of the planet, and add more we'll have plenty of energy to accelerate the Haber-Bosch process even more. We'll fix even more nitrogen. We'll have even more nitrous oxide emissions. So yeah, so I think solving the carbon problem without thinking about our broader societal metabolism is maybe a little, it can have pitfalls. So coming back to nitrous oxide, that's a really challenging problem. I mean, I think what somebody estimated, I can't remember the number, something like 2 billion people have been fed over the last 50 years purely because of nitrogen. I can't remember the numbers, right? So it had a huge impact on society in terms of increasing our food production. How are we going to reduce that? So people talk about using, well, maybe we don't use synthetic fertilizer, we can use organic fertilizers or compost and all of that. That does have benefits in the sense that we are not creating new kind of reactive nitrogen. We are not using Haber-Bosch process, but we are trying to recycle nitrogen. So that can be a good thing.
But they still meant nitrous oxide, manures and compost has the same chemistry.
They're still going to, yeah, they're still, that's the thing. You're applying a different form of nitrogen, and you're still going to have the leaching problem. You're still going to have the nitrous oxide problem. You're recycling it and using it more efficiently, but
We just
yeah.
have to use less of it. And I mean, our colleague Nathan Mueller, you and I've worked with in the past, actually did some nice estimates of like, it's kind of the ultimate Goldilocks problem. There are some parts of the world that don't have enough nitrogen in the soil, and there are some places that have too much. That becomes a pollution problem. And there are only a handful of places that get it just right. I think there were like Australia and Brazil kind of had like the more optimum amount of fertilizer being used that was actually really efficiently used to grow the most crops you could get. But the US, India, China, and other countries use so much more, like 2 or 3 times the fertilizer the plants could ever possibly use up, because there's just bad policies and nobody pays the cost for that. And that pollutes the waterways and contributes to climate change. There are probably some pretty obvious things we could do, but they do need some policy backups, maybe how we think about crop insurance and how we subsidize agriculture needs to be adjusted to have more of a kind of a public good in mind. I don't know. What do you think about that?
That's, yeah, I mean, that's a great point, which is that, and if you use crop insurance, we have to incentivize the right behavior, right? So right now, the way we've set up crop insurance is that we essentially provide a floor for farmers to have losses. But the crop insurance is not not necessarily tied to better environmental outcomes. So essentially, crop insurance is if you have a weather shock, if you have a drought or you have some kind of shock, you get some kind of price support. So I often think about, we need biological insurance more than kind of financial insurance. We need to build systems that are much more resilient and much more environmentally friendly. And how we do that, there's a big debate about that. Some people talk about using more diversification, using growing more legumes within your crops so that you don't have to apply as much nitrogen, using more crop rotations, and stuff like that. Nathan Muller's study was interesting. I think we estimated that we can increase food production by 30% with only a 9% increase in N, which is great. But I think about that later, and I was like, well, you're still increasing N. We're not decreasing N, right? Like, we're doing it more efficiently, but we probably need to bring nitrogen use down to maybe half or even less.
Yeah.
How we are going to do that, that's a huge challenge.
Well, one of the things you mentioned too, of course, is kind of larger demand side parts of the equation. We always like to talk about how we produce stuff in a new way. I don't know, maybe it's just sexier. But half the story, whether it's energy or food, is often about the efficiency of what we already grow and already produce. So we're going to talk a lot about in this class around food waste and diets, which are kind of obvious but still underexploited changes, especially food waste. We just don't seem to do enough or talk enough about that. So I'd love to explore that with you as well. But also in the diet things, there's kind of a simplify your diet, get the red meat out a little bit, more plant rich, things like this. But then there's all this excitement about alternative meats and being high tech solutions to what could be a low tech problem in some ways. I don't know. Maybe we need it all. But what are your perspectives on this? You're really one of the world's leading experts on these issues. What are some of the what are some of the things you think about when you think about kind of reducing the pressure on the food system so we don't have to push it so hard?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Yeah, we tend to focus a lot on thinking about the supply side, like how can we produce our food better? But there's always a question of, do we need to produce all this food? The World Resources Institute, I think you probably know about this, their report that came out last year. They have this nice figure where they lay out a set of different, I think it was like 17 different solutions to address the climate change problem, but also the food problem. They kind of, I don't think it's ranked, but if you look at their portfolio of different solutions, I think they call it different menus. If you look at the menu that's focused on improving efficiency in the agricultural system, yeah, it's important, but it's not the big leverage. The big leverage are the first two in their list, which is food waste and shifting diets. And in their suite of 17 solutions, those two, I think, are about 40% of the entire solution set. So that's huge.
It's similar to what Drawdown finds too. When we look at all the different solutions we've looked at, and a similar kind of different way of calculating them and stuff, but the numbers sort of match up pretty similarly. It's like when you lose a third of the food, that means probably about a third of the greenhouse gases are right sitting there anyway. And then when you've got a food like red meat that takes 30 times the calories of plants to grow it to get 1 calorie of beef, you got a big leverage point there. These are just inevitably very big levers in the system, is waste and red meat. So why are we focusing more on that?
I mean, I think I would say in the last couple of years that shifted, the conversation around that has shifted. The Eat Lancet report especially did a huge splash on and kind of increasing awareness among people that actually eating more plant-based diets can be not only beneficial for the planet, but also beneficial for human health. So that combination, I think, it is changing people's minds. In the United States, the data clearly shows that people are eating less beef and switching towards eating more poultry. They're still eating meat, but a lot of it is driven by health concerns, that there's more people are worried about cardiovascular diseases related to eating red meat. You're also talking about kind of new innovations in producing more plant-based meats, like Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger and and others. It's interesting because I used to be skeptical about them at the beginning. When it first came out, I thought, it's going to be way too expensive and nobody's going to eat it. But I know I'm eating my own words now, because I think their prices become fairly comparable. It's like $1 or more sometimes in Canada. Impossible Burger still hasn't made it across the border. I want to try it. The other thing is, I think they've done some life cycle analysis, and it seems to show that their environmental footprint is far lower than regular beef. I've seen the New York Times, I think, had a report where they did a whole bunch of taste tests between the Impossible Burger and a real burger, and people couldn't actually distinguish between the two, which is amazing. So it seems to work. The only thing I hesitate is that, there is a lot of, and this is an area I don't know a lot about, so it's based on reading other people's stuff, it's about the health concerns of processed food. So there's a lot of, seems to be evidence that, a lot of our obesity crisis and kind of micronutrient deficiency crisis are related to eating more processed foods. But I think there is processed food and processed food, right? So maybe not all processed food is the same. Impossible Burger is probably one of the most heavily processed food items you can think about. It's entirely synthesized. But so I would want to wait to see what the kind of long-term health impacts are.
Yeah. There's always going to be inevitable kind of things we learn and trade-offs along the way. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, I guess it's a little bit of a segue here, but is I'd love to get your thoughts about, we talked a lot about beef. And one is very clear on one lens that eating less beef reduces pressure on land, water, greenhouse gases, and so on. Just because beef is a very intensive kind of animal to grow for calories, for protein, especially feedlot beef. But then there's this kind of pushback. Some of it's from science, but most of it's from an advocacy lens of people very passionate about what they're calling regenerative agriculture, especially the kind of grazing systems, where it is clear that when you manage grazing differently, you could create grasslands that, for a while anyway, absorb some more carbon and can maybe offset some of those emissions. And some would claim offset even more, far more emissions than they produce. I'm a little skeptical of that, because the soils don't accumulate carbon that fast, that long. And the cows are going to keep burping methane the whole time. But what do you think about regenerative agriculture? I mean, there's clearly some good things here, but are we in danger of overselling it? Or is this something we should just do no matter what, because it has so many multiple benefits? Or is it really a big, big climate solution we've been overlooking for a long time? What do you think?
I mean, I think regenerative agriculture, or even more broadly, doing farming in a way that's beneficial for the environment, beneficial for soils, beneficial for biodiversity, I'm all for it, right? That we should be doing that. But is that a climate solution? It could be, but I don't think it is. I worry that, so I do think that people have hyped it too much. And my biggest worry related to that is kind of the slippery slope that if we focus so much on this being the solution, the big solution, that we are not going to stop mitigating emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. This is exactly what ExxonMobil probably wants you to believe, that we can solve this problem by planting trees and having regenerative agriculture, right? So I feel like by buying into this hype, we are buying into this hands of fossil fuel companies that want to delay actions. But coming back to what do I know and understand about regenerative agriculture, I think is exactly what you said, which is, okay, so let's say you start from a really, really degraded land where the soil carbon has been completely drawn down, and you start farming that in a better way. It is very likely in those first few years, that soil is going to take a lot of carbon up, and that carbon that's being taken up offsets some of the methane emissions that's coming from the cow. Great. So the first few years you're offsetting it, but that soil is going to saturate. It can't take up carbon forever. That's just how the system works. There are microbes as you put more and more carbon. So often think of it as a bathtub, right? We do this in systems dynamics classes. If you have a tap and you're filling it with water and there's a drain, at some point when the amount of water going in is the same as the amount of water going out, the drain kind of fills up, the bathtub fills up, or in fact, if you increase the speed even more, the bathtub spills. And the same kind of thing you can think about in a soil, that as you put more carbon in, the microbes in the soil are eating that carbon and it's coming back out as carbon dioxide. And at some point that'll come to a balance and the soil will not be able to take any more carbon. Okay, so let's say for the first 10 years, you're managed to offset your methane emissions from the cow with carbon being sequestered in the soil, and then it stops. After that point, the cow is going to keep emitting methane, but you have no more carbon storage. So I think it's not a long-term solution. I think you can do that for maybe, I don't know. I don't know if we have enough data to know for how long you can have that offset, or even if it's even possible everywhere in the world. There are lots of really good scientists who are trying to study this. So I don't want to poo-poo this, but some of the hype we are seeing out there, I think, is misguided. It's not following the science. It's following sort of extrapolations from one or two numbers here and there.
Yeah, it's very clear that the scientific community, people like Rattan Lal and others who've been working on this stuff for 30 years, he just won the world, Soil Prize and all this kind of stuff for his work is amazing, showing, yes, there are impacts that are good. They're kind of short to medium term, and then they maybe not saturate, but they certainly slow down dramatically. And that's just the reality. But then there are a few groups. The Rodale Institute just published a study a few weeks ago where they extrapolated one field site for like 1 year to the whole world forever. They came up with a ridiculous number. It's kind of like, like saying that if Bill Gates and I walk into a bar, everyone on earth is a billionaire. That's not true because you're kind of cherry picking the data. And so we have to be a little bit careful about the disconnect between what the science is showing us in regenerative agriculture, which is positive and like we should do it. But it's one of many little climate solutions we need to deploy, as opposed to the big silver bullet that some would like us to maybe believe. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should do it. Just when we oversell it, like you said, it might give more permission to the fossil fuel industry and others to keep burning coal because we can just pay the farmers to take care of it for us. But what if the farmers can't? And what I worry about too is like the farmers in America, I don't know what it's in Canada, but here 40% of all the farmland is leased under 5 years.
Yeah.
So you might farm this wonderful regenerative agriculture for a while, then the lease is up or the farmer retires. The next farmer plows it all up again or does something different. All that carbon's right back in the atmosphere. So there's an asymmetry between turning off a coal power plant, for example, and soaking up the pollution after you put it in the air into some fancy soil grazing scheme. It's kind of, that's a stupid analogy I'm thinking of, but if you don't like cream in your coffee, you don't put it in the coffee in the first place. It'd be much harder to put cream in your coffee than invent some interesting chemistry that removes the cream afterward. It's a hell of a lot easier. Just don't put it in there in the first place. So in Drawdown, I like to focus on like, hey, let's stop the pollution before it's in the sky. And then we'll let nature remove what it can, but relying on that is kind of like after you spilled it on the floor. You want to avoid the mess in the first place.
Yeah.
But we need it all. And
Yeah.
agriculture is this interesting mix of reducing sources of pollution, like deforestation and nitrous oxide you mentioned, as well as maybe some capacity to absorb some of what's
Yeah.
left. We have the
Yeah.
faucet of your bathtub and we have a sponge. You know?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite paper on this is a study that was done by Bronson Griscom and a whole bunch of colleagues I think it was in 2017, where they first invented the term natural climate solutions. It's a really excellent paper. They don't oversell it, but they just sort of try to estimate what the potential is, and they also look at cost effective estimates. They don't just say this is the maximum, but like what can we do at $100 a ton, right? And they estimate that to be about half of the maximum potential. But they also make the point very clearly that it can help. Mother Nature can help during a transition to a future world. So there are many. I think some colleagues at Stanford or Carnegie Institution, I think, estimated that there are about 30% of our emissions are really, really hard to abate, right? Flying is one of the classic ones, but also cement production, long distance trucks and steel, and yeah. So it's going to take us a while before we figure out how to do that. And so if we want to get to net zero by 2050, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be easier with some part of our industrial and energy related emissions, but not others. So while we try to figure that out, Mother Nature can help us by absorbing some of that, right? Being a sponge. But those emissions, Mother Nature can't help us forever because of the saturation problem these estimates that have been made for reforestation or regenerative agriculture, they might last about maybe 20, 30 years, after which their effectiveness will decrease. And then there's the problem you mentioned, which is what happens. You can't assure that they will remain there permanently. Another farmer can plow it up and it's all back. Land can be a source or a sink, can shift from being a source or a sink really rapidly. So the Canadian forest, for example, used to be a carbon sink until 2002, until 2001. And suddenly in 2002, around that period, the mountain pine beetle infestation happened. And now since 2002, we have been a source of carbon. We rapidly switched from taking carbon out to now releasing it. Fires in California and other places, can we rely on planting trees and hope that they will stay? Yeah, so I think we can't deal with the Band-Aid. We have to deal with the emissions first.
Well, that's great. Well, we just have a minute left here. I guess I would ask maybe the last question is like, what gets you most excited across this big array of kind of food and land use related solutions we've talked about? The good news, I guess, is there are a lot of them. But which of these is kind of giving you the most kind of hope and excitement right now that you think is really going to start to make a big difference?
Yeah, I think the first one is what I mentioned at the beginning, which is I'm really inspired by today's youth. They are really clamoring for solutions. They're out on the street. They're pushing their parents. They're pushing us to do things. For me personally, I've been studying kind of climate and food system science for 20 years, but I'm ashamed to say I had never been to a protest before until the one that happened last year. That was my first kind of big climate protest in Vancouver, and I had a sign that said it's my first time, but better late than never. But I feel more inspired by the younger people than I am by the older people, and that gives me faith that the next generation is thinking more seriously than we have. I also think that we have to be careful and not make it their problem. We created this problem. We were contributed to it, so we should be inspired, but we should do the hard work. We shouldn't let them do the hard work. So that's one. The second thing that's really inspired me is sort of the speed at which renewables are starting to move into the landscape. They're moving in much faster, wind and solar, than I think anyone anticipated, anyone forecast. And just during this year, during the COVID time period, fossil fuels apparently have gone down, but renewables have actually expanded. I remember a panel discussion that you organized a few years ago in California, where this woman who's from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and she was talking about how their strategy is to just file lawsuits against coal-fired power plants, and they don't need to do anything except stall them, because after 2 years, wind and solar are priced better. And so it doesn't make any sense to build them anymore. So that gives me hope. I also see like a lot of political action around the world. UBC hasn't completely divested, but it's divesting part of its portfolio. A lot of universities, some organizations have all divested from fossil fuels. So ExxonMobil was kicked out of Dow Jones Index, I think, if I remember right. So the kind of social tipping point seems to be all moving in the right direction. We have a huge inertia in the system, but I'm hopeful that the social inertia can overcome that. Another positive thing I saw, I don't know whether to think of this as positive or not, but all indications, if you follow the recent trends, is that we are heading towards 3 degrees Celsius. We're not heading towards one, like if you don't change anything, we're not heading toward 1.5 or 2, if you think of current business as usual, but we are not heading to 4 or 5 degrees either, as we had imagined at some point. Just because I think there's not enough coal to even, that it's impossible to get to 3. I think there have been studies talking about this RCP 8.5 scenario of the IPCC being kind of discredited, right? So it gives me hope. I guess 3 is much worse than 1.5 or 2, but it's much better than 4 or 5. So that's kind of a glass is half full and half empty at the same time.